Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is part 2 of Week 8's lecture series for Geology 309, Bringing Fossils to Life. We're going to be covering other arthropods from the fossil record. If you remember, in part 1, we covered all of Trilobitomorpha. So this actually is considerably shorter in a lecture because when we're dealing with arthropods in the fossil record, it's ostracods, trilobites, and that's about it. But we're going to cover the other ones that we do happen to have. If you'll recall, Arthropoda had a number of subphyla, including Trilobitomorpha, which we covered in part 1. And now we'll be looking at the remaining groups. So Crustacea, Tracheata, which remember is sometimes called Uniramia. This includes insects and centipedes. And Chelicerata, so Eurypterids, horseshoe crabs, and arachnids. There's also a possibility that we have several other subgroups of arthropods that are just now extinct, just like Trilobitomorpha. That is a distinct possibility. Since we don't have a great fossil record of every single group of arthropods outside of our calcium carbonate exoskeleton producing ones like trilobites and ostracods, we have to rely on the very important fossil deposits of Lagerstätten throughout the Phanerozoic to check in on some of our arthropods throughout geologic history. So, for example, we can see what's going on in the lower Cambrian for arthropods by looking at the Xinjiang Formation in China. We can see the middle Cambrian in the Burgess Shale of Canada. We can then check in again in the Devonian in Germany with the Hunsrück Shale, and here's where we start to see pycnogonid sea spiders and other kinds of arthropods. The Rhynie Chert from the lower Devonian of Scotland gives us insects and vascular plants. And the Mazon Creek from Illinois gives us Pennsylvanian arthropods, both marine and terrestrial. And then if we want to see Oligocene or Miocene or any of the other earlier Cenozoic arthropods, we can look at amber from the Dominican Republic. So as you can see, we don't have anything, for example, well represented of this type of thing from like the Jurassic. There are some Jurassic locations where you get arthropods, but they're pretty rare. So these are some of the more important ones where we can kind of pop in and see, well, what's going on in the early Paleozoic, middle Paleozoic, later Paleozoic. As you notice, the Mesozoic, we don't have a lot. There's a few carbonized fossils that we have that indicate what's going on with some of our arthropods. We know that, there's a relationship between insects and flowers in the Cretaceous, for example, but we don't see detailed Triassic or even Permian arthropods preserved really well in Lagerstätten. So we have to kind of check in and see what's happening throughout these particular periods. So from the information we have, especially from these Lagerstätten deposits and a few other well-preserved carbonized fossils, here are the major arthropod radiations that we know of throughout the Phanerozoic. In the Proterozoic through the Cambrian, all arthropods were marine. In the Silurian, we see the transition of arthropods onto land or shallow fresh water, and these would be things like hexapods, decapods, myriapods, and chelicerates. In the mid-Paleozoic, we start seeing our first winged insects. So this would be around the Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. By the late Cretaceous, though, symbiosis with angiosperms, as we mentioned, with bees and ants, first starts to become apparent. And then to a lesser radiation in the tertiary, we see things like mites and other kind of parasites on mammals, though there is some evidence of that happening even in the Mesozoic as well. So let's start looking at some of the other subphyla, and we'll begin with Crustacea, which goes back to possibly the Proterozoic, but definitely the Cambrian, and obviously still around today. There are about 10 orders within Crustacea. Crustaceans have biramous appendages in their primitive forms, and then uniramous appendages later. So modern day shrimp and crabs come to single points on their feet, but if you look at earlier ones, they actually were biramous, kind of like trilobites in that way. Their bodies are subdivided into a head, thorax, and abdomen. They have 2 pairs of preoral antennae, 1 pair of postoral mandibles. So that means that the modified parts of their limbs, they have the antenna in front of the mouth, and then behind the mouth they have their actual mandibles. Marine and freshwater, and we actually have truly terrestrial crustaceans, if you think about it. So we have some crabs that live on land, like hermit crabs. And all of them use respiration by a modified type of gill. It's a gill in the same sense of the word in its function that fish would have, but it is that is convergent, so it's evolved in a different way. So one of the classes we have is class Branchiopoda. These are around from, again, possibly Proterozoic, but definitely Cambrian to today. And these are small marine crustaceans. And you can see they almost look like bivalves until you open up the inside and see that there's a small crustacean inside. So this is one group of crustaceans that we have that actually do produce, some of them did produce calcium carbonate shells. Another class of crustacean would be Malacostraca. These are from the Devonian to today. Malacostracans include what I call our tasty arthropods, so our crabs, lobsters, shrimp, but it also includes things like isopods, so terrestrial pill bugs, little roly-poles, so to speak, and also krill, which are very, very small and mostly eaten by baleen whales. Some crabs and lobsters will lightly calcify their shells, but this usually happens more in the Cretaceous. We have about 20,000 species described to date. These generally have between 19 to 20 segments. Their cephalon has 5 segments, or their head has 5 segments. Their thorax has 8, and the abdomen 6 or 7. A common order of Malacostracans is Decapoda, again, 10 limbs. Crabs, lobsters, crayfish, shrimp, hermit crabs, mantis shrimp. If you've not looked up the mantis shrimp, they're pretty cool. I recommend Googling those. They are awesome. So Malacostracans all share these basic common features. And again, 20,000 species. These are very, very abundant. Ones that regularly calcify include Malacostraca. So these are ostracods. Ostracods are a type of Malacostracan crustacean. They are bivalved, similar to the Branchiopods we just looked at. Most common crustacean fossil, 1900 genre described just from fossils. And some of these are actually useful for biostratigraphy. There's also another subclass within Malacostraca that does leave a fairly good calcified fossil record, and this is Eurypteridia, which from the Cambrian also to today, these are barnacles. They'll cement themselves upside down into this kind of almond or diamond-shaped, actually I think they look like little volcanoes, calcium carbonate structures that they live inside of. And they actually bore into the substrate in some parts, leaving this kind of diamond or almond-shaped trace fossil. When they die, their plates tend to disaggregate rather quickly, so finding one preserved is a little bit more difficult. There is a place in Tennessee called Coon Creek that is Cretaceous in age, where you get Cretaceous barnacles and some Cretaceous crabs as well that have calcified quite well, and it gives us an idea of what's going on with some of the calcified maxillopods from the Cretaceous. But most of these maxillopods that we're going to be seeing from the fossil record, many of these come from more unique Lagerstätten deposits. So here we have some images of ostracods at the top and barnacles at the bottom. Again, when you look at an ostracod, they almost look like a bivalve, but there's a tiny little crustacean inside. And with the barnacles, they see what I mean by a little volcano-shaped structure, but inside there's a small crustacean that doesn't get up and move around. So these are stationary, they're benthic, and they live in these clusters. And they have extra plates that they use to help close up their valves when they are not feeding, essentially, using these little legs that they grab food with called cirri. Our next subphylum group are the Tracheates, or the Uniramians. This includes insects. And the most abundant group is Superclass Hexapoda, which have been around from the Devonian to today. And these are our proper insects and all of their related members. These are all Uniramias, hence Uniramia being another name for Tracheata, where their limbs come to a single point. They have a well-developed head, thorax, and abdomen. So think of an ant, for example. They have a head, they have the next section, which is the thorax, and then an abdomen. And again, if we think of an ant as a good example of a tracheate, they have one pair of preoral antennae, and then a pair of what we call whole limb mandibles. So this is actually a form of their limbs that have been modified into mandibles. And then behind that, two extra pairs, at least two extra pairs of specialized appendages that are post-orally, so behind the mouth. The thorax is with 3 segments, and each one has a leg pair, hence the hexapoda or 6-limbed structure within these. These are mostly terrestrial, though we have some that are partially aquatic. Most of our hexapods, most of our insects are actually terrestrial. And they breathe through a trachea, so they're not using gills like crustaceans, but they actually breathe through a trachea. Again, similar in function to what we use, but it's unique to arthropods, or at least unique to tracheates and hexapods in its evolution. So it's a convergence. There are over 1 million described species. And most of these are actually coleopterids, which is a specialized group of hexapods that are beetles. There are possibly several million undescribed species of hexapods. So if you think about it, to a first approximation, all animals are insects. The rest of us just kind of make up the pocket change. So let's look at class Insecta a little bit. These have been around since the Devonian. All of our insects have exposed mouth parts. So if you think about, again, an ant with its pincers, its mandibles in the front, you can see those. Even if you look at certain kinds of bees and wasps, even though they're not stinging you with this, their mouth parts are exposed. Many of these have wings, at least primitively. Sometimes it's sexual dimorphism, and sometimes it's just part of the hierarchy of the colony, but insects have, most of them have wings. And wings actually developed as flaps on the dorsal side in the Pennsylvanian. Dragonflies are one of the more primitive flying insects, and they actually have non-retractable wings. Cockroaches are actually the first that have retractable wings for protection. So when a cockroach or beetle flies, they lift up these plates off of their exoskeleton, and the membranous wings are underneath, and that's what they extend out. 5,000 different genera described from fossils alone, many of these just from single specimens. And we have over 870,000 living species described for insects. And some entomologists actually estimate we have anywhere, depending on the entomologist, between 5 to 20 million living species, including obviously many that have not been described. Another important fact about insects is that they undergo metamorphosis, and this is something that was certainly developed by the Mesozoic because we do have some fossilized caterpillars from that point. Another superclass are the Myriapods, possibly Cambrian and Ordovician, definitely Silurian onward. We think of these as the many-legged arthropods. These include Diplopoda and Chelopoda, or millipedes and centipedes, respectively. These all have Uniramia appendages as well, but they have very poorly differentiated body segments. When you look at a millipede or a centipede, you can see there's lots of segments, but they're not as differentiated as we see with Malacostracans or what we see with other insects. All myriapods have 1 pair of preoral antennae, 1 pair of whole limb mandibles, 1 or 2 pairs of maxillipeds, so other limbs, and then a variable number of appendages, pairs behind the head. So they have a specialized set of limbs, a couple of pair of them right behind the mouth, and then they have all sorts of limbs going back beyond that. Mostly today, these are terrestrial, though we do have some primitively marine myriapods. They also breathe through a trachea, so a tube that helps with gas exchange. And some of these got quite large. There's Arthropleura, which is a millipede from the Pennsylvanian that some estimates put it between 6 and 8 feet long. So, which is what you see here, just a small specimen of one. Let's look a little bit at Cheliceratans. Chelicerata, these are spiders, scorpions, ticks, and sea spiders, so everybody's favorite for some reason. These are around from the Cambrian to today. So all chelicerates have one pair of, are all uniramious with their appendages. They come to a single point on the foot. The body is divided, instead of into all these head, abdomen, thorax, it's essentially a prosoma and an opistosoma, which is the abdomen. So it's a head and a body, with the exception of parasitic ticks. They have a slightly different setup. These have one pair of preoral appendages, and then 5 pairs of postoral appendages, including antennae and mandibles being absent. So if you think of a spider, okay, which some people prefer not to, but we're going to have to. One pair of preoral appendages. These are things in the front like mouth parts. And then at least 5, sometimes, I should say 5 or 4 pairs of postoral appendages. Sometimes spiders have their mouth parts and a very specialized subset of mouth parts, and then 8 legs past that. These are obviously all predators, mostly terrestrial, though we do have a few aquatic ones, such as sea scorpions, or sea spiders, excuse me, but spiders, scorpions, and ticks are all predatory or at least parasitic. These breathe with gills with our aquatic taxa and a trachea with our terrestrial taxa. So it's interesting that we have both forms present in Chelicerata, while we have talked about trachea or gills with crustaceans and insects being somewhat separate. Here we have both present. So yet again, we might be seeing convergence there. So let's talk about class Arachnida. We have spiders possibly from the Cambrian Ordovician, but definitely Silurian onward. These are mostly in an order called Arachnida, where we start from the Pennsylvanian to today we have our proper spiders. Order Acarinae from the Pennsylvanian onward includes mites and ticks, and we have these preserved in the Illinois Mazon Creek formation and fauna from Braidwood, Illinois. Order Scorpionidae, obviously scorpions. These have been around since the Silurian. Scorpions are among the first terrestrial animals on the planet. And order Pycnogonidae, which are our sea spiders from the Cambrian, possibly again Silurian, definitely onward. And these are from the Hunsrück Shale. So this is what we mean by the preoral appendage. You can see I know most of you are not appreciating looking at this right now, but you can see it has the 8 legs and then those preoral, or the kind of preoral appendages to those smaller little guys. Let's get a better look at that guy. There you go. All right, class Merostomata. Again, possibly Cambrian, definitely Ordovician onward. Subclass Xiphosaura. Xiphosaurians are really, really important. They've been around since the Devonian to today. The name Xiphosaura means sword tail. These are horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs actually today are not only just an important, I hate to use the term living fossil, but there it is. Also, they are used humanely to harvest their blood, which is used for lots and lots of medicines that we use. Their blood is blue, which is really weird. So they'll be captured, they'll bled out a little bit, nurse back to health, and then return to the oceans. Their bodies are broken up into a prosoma and an opistosoma, similar to something like spiders, but then they have that prominent telson, the long sword-like tail coming off of their bodies. Xiphosaurians, like horseshoe crabs, are jawless. They have 6 pair of limbs on the prosoma, 5 of which are clawed. Their appendages of the opistosoma are modified into these book-like gills. So if you look at the bottom side of a horseshoe crab, they have a whole bunch of gills that are actually modified appendages that they use for breathing underwater. And they also have lots and lots of light-sensing organs, in addition to very well-developed eyes. So if you think about it, horseshoe crabs are living in murkier waters. They'll sometimes scurry under sediment. They need to be able to sense light to know when they're getting close to the surface. They're not very good swimmers, and interestingly, when they do swim, they flip upside down and kind of fold themselves open and closed to flit through the water. They also can tolerate very low salinity, so we don't find them in hypersaline environments. And they're amphibious in a lifestyle. They're not amphibians, they're amphibious. They mate and lay eggs on land in these muddy intertidal zones, and then they go back to the water for the rest of their lives. So when the eggs hatch, the little baby horseshoe crabs work their way to the water as quickly as possible. So here is Limulus, the common horseshoe crab. When you look at the bottom side, you can see the book gills and the limbs and that prominent tail spine, the telson, sticking out of the back. Now, our last subclass is the Eurypterids. Eurypterids were around from the Ordovician through the Permian, but they were especially abundant in the Silurian and the Devonian when they were among some of the dominant predators of the seas. They have 12 thoracic segments, 4 pair of walking appendages that they used for submarine walking. They would walk around on the seafloor as well as swim. And they have 1 pair of very strong swimming appendages, sometimes modified into almost boxing glove type clubs and sometimes pincing claws. Generally, 1 pair of these, the anterior claws that we see on our larger predatory Eurypterids. These also may have been amphibious. They may have walked into the shallow waters similar to horseshoe crabs, but that's debated among paleontologists. And they got big. These got up to 2 meters long with lots and lots of eyes. So here you can see some Eurypterid fossils. You can even see the eyes preserved on these and that long pointed tail spine at the end. So they're kind of like horseshoe crabs. They're closer related to horseshoe crabs than they are to actual scorpions, despite the nickname of sea scorpions. And that's a reconstruction of one in life. So again, a short follow-up to our discussion on trilobites, but I figured this would be a better way of kind of packaging our other arthropod fossils. For next week, we are going to be covering phylum Mollusca, both in lecture and lab, but I will be posting the exam number 2, which covers weeks 6 and 8. I know there's yet another exam coming up, but this way we keep the exams a little bit smaller. This exam will include all of the phyla we've discussed thus far. So remember those facts on the ecology and characteristics of archaeocyathans, porifera, cnidarians, our lophophorids, the brachiopods and bryozoans, and of course the arthropods. I'll be available to answer any questions you may have. If anybody's interested in doing a review session, we certainly can. But what I would like you to focus on for the exam is don't worry about trying to memorize a whole bunch of species or genre. That's not the point. Understand evolutionary trends, identifiable characteristics for major groups, and their paleoecology, and how those have changed over time. Again, you will have a time limit, at least a couple of days to finish the exam, and I would prefer the exam to be typed and submitted, but also be prepared to possibly have some diagrams as well. So if you don't have any questions, I will see you in lab.